Welcome, everyone. I think I speak for Debbie and Dan, but we are so excited to have you join us to experience a place that we dearly love. And we're looking forward to meeting all of you. We're excited that some of you are rejoining us after a couple of our other tours, and hope also, and I know that, the lecturers that we've asked are excellent. And that we're going to learn a lot from them, and I'm looking forward to hearing from each one of them. Let me introduce Dr. Horrocks to you. Dr. Jamie Horrocks is currently an associate professor of English at Brigham Young University. She earned a BA and MA in English and Art History from BYU and a PhD in English Victorian Studies from Indiana University in 2010. She's been teaching at BYU since 2010, and from 2002 to 2009 was an associate instructor and teaching fellow at Indiana University. Dr. Horrocks has spoken at numerous conferences and published extensively on Victorian literature, poetry, art society, printmaking, and architecture. She's taught some 35 plus courses in her teaching career and is a member of the Dickens International Society, the North American Victorian Studies Association, and has studied, researched, interned, and overseen study abroad programs in the UK. I've only had the pleasure of knowing Jamie since I first contacted her, and she graciously agreed to deliver 2 of our pre-tour lectures, but I think it's safe to say that she is a kindred spirit and confirmed Anglophile with an abiding love for everything British, who, like me, needs little more than an invite and 24 hours notice to pack her bags and join a friend on a trip to the UK. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to turn the time over to Professor Horrocks.
Thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction. Like Chris said, I am a professor of Victorian literature at BYU. So I specialize in British literature and culture, mostly from about 1830 to 1900, which is more or less the period during which Queen Victoria stood on the throne, or I guess sat on the throne. And, students often ask me how I became interested in the Victorian era. I always confess that I was converted through the books, these wonderful novels that perhaps some of you guys read when you were growing up or in school. But I think that I was also attracted to Victorian literature in part because it seemed like home to me. The Victorian era was the period of time in which our church was formed and many of our key religious documents were written. So the way that we do religion today bears the hallmarks of 19th century ways of thinking. And when I first discovered this era, it felt right for me because it felt familiar. Let me give you an example of what I mean. If you take a look at the clip that I'm showing you here over on the left-hand side of the screen, I have also given Chris a handout with the text that I'm going to be talking about today printed out for you so that if it's easier to read on a piece of paper rather than on the slides, you can follow along here. These will be the first 2 clips. In fact, I'll show you the second one right now. Clips A and B on your handout. But if you take a look at these and skim over just a couple of the lines, I wonder if they'll sound vaguely familiar to you, right? This first one over on the left-hand side starts, "Awake, O nightmare sleepers, awake, arise, or be forever fallen." And if you compare that over to the reading on the left, it too starts with, "Awake, arise," or "Oh, that you would awake, awake from a deep sleep, yea, even from the sleep of hell. Shake off the chains by which bind the children of men." So those of you with a really good eye or a good memory will know that this second clip B over here, comes from Second Nephi, chapter 1, as Lehi exhorts his children just before he dies. But clip A, which certainly sounds like it could have been written by Lehi, was actually written by this man. His name is Thomas Carlyle. He was a Scottish writer and a historian who cared very deeply about the condition of England in 1843, which is when the essay that this clip comes from was published. Carlyle wrote an enormous amount over the course of his life, but he also published a famous series of essays called Latter-day Pamphlets. And when I was coming up in school, this was the first time I had ever heard the phrase Latter Day in conjunction with something other than our church, and so it immediately struck a chord with me. And you can see why this type of writing, it felt familiar to me when I first encountered it, because Carlyle uses the same 19th century rhetorical style that comes out of the mouth of the early church leaders like Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and John Taylor and others like him who were raised at a time when religion was fervent in its passions, and when people cared very deeply about the state of their world and the individual's responsibility within that world. This is, I think, one of the things that I like most about the writers and thinkers in the Victorian era. They cared. They felt a moral responsibility to make their communities better. And in fact, the kind of writing that Carlyle did, and that a lot of the other writers that I'll share with you today became famous for, is actually called Condition of England writing, because it attempts to reveal the condition of England in especially the early 1800s. And they weren't joking when they talked about the condition of England being troubled in the early part of the 19th century, when Heber C. Kimball and a few others, landed at Liverpool and began their missionary service in the UK. What Dickens famously wrote in his opening sentence of A Tale of Two Cities, you might recognize part of it right here on the slide, it was really true of England in the 19th century, even though it was describing France or Paris during the French Revolution, right? Dickens wrote that it was the best of times, but it was also the worst of times. It was the spring of hope and it was the winter of despair. And that's a really nice way of thinking about the early 19th century in Britain. There was certainly lots of things to be hopeful about and lots of things to be excited about. For one, there was a brand new monarch on the throne. Queen Victoria had just been coronated in 1837. In fact, she'd only been on the throne a couple of weeks when the missionaries arrived up in Liverpool. She was very young when she was made queen. She was just 18 years old, and she was tiny. She never grew more than 5 feet tall. And so people described her, in her coronation robes and gowns in Westminster as looking like a little tiny girl who had just been crowned Queen of England. So Queen Victoria would quickly, after she was coronated, she quickly married her German cousin, and they went on to have 9 children before her cousin, his name was Prince Albert, died sadly early. And because of the fact that she was a mother and that she had so many children, and the children were often in the public eye, Queen Victoria came to have a kind of maternal presence on a nation. And this was important because the nation at that time was fed up with the debauched lifestyle of the regent, King George IV. King George IV loved wine and women and parties. He spent a lot of money. He was always getting himself in trouble. He had a lot of illegitimate children. And, when he died and the throne passed to Queen Victoria, um, the whole atmosphere of the monarchy seemed to shift because she was young, because she was female, and she was always or often portrayed with her children and with her family, like in this very famous painting. She came to embody a kind of emphasis on family and domesticity. So during her reign, the British Empire became the wealthiest nation on earth, thanks largely to England's early embrace of steam power and also its colonization of countries around the globe, right? So in 1830, the world's first commercial railroad line was laid in England. It connected London with those industrial powerhouse cities that you'll Manchester and Liverpool. This was an enormous event. People came out, they threw parades, and shortly after this first railroad was laid, hundreds of thousands of miles of additional track were laid all over England, and then also out in the colonies as well. And this was incredibly important because it gave people a new type of mobility that they had never had, but it also gave goods a kind of mobility. You could get produce quickly to new markets, but you could also get, non-expirable goods all over the country and all over the empire very, very quickly. It was up in Lancashire, in fact, up in what's called the industrial north, or sometimes it's called the industrial Midlands, where the missionaries landed. And I know this is very small, but if you look on this map, the industrial Midlands are sort of this part right here where England kind of gets skinny before going up north further into Scotland. And you can see if you have really good eyes, all of the different industrial industries that were spread throughout Britain. But because the missionaries landed up north, they got a first row glimpse of the kinds of things that industrialism was doing, the way that it was changing Britain's landscape. And this put Britain in a really unusual position. So, as one writer said, when he was writing an essay on Manchester, he said that pure gold seemed to flow out of cities like Manchester. Um, as this one writer claimed, oh, can we get you guys to mute your camera or mute your mics there? Oh, there we go. Okay, I can hear myself again. Sorry about that. My mic was cutting out. I was just going to say that, this one writer who was talking about his first trip to industrial Manchester, he was amazed at the wealth in the city. And he wrote that pure gold seemed to flow out of cities like Manchester and Liverpool. But at the same time, that gold seemed to flow from what he called a filthy sewer. And that's because industrialization, which on the one hand, it caused British GDP to skyrocket, it also ironically cost Britain's workers pretty dearly in terms of their quality of life. So, as you might know already, as agriculture was mechanized, displaced farm workers migrated to cities where factory work was plentiful. But factory work at this period of time, even though it was plentiful, it was almost entirely unregulated. And those cities that had a lot of factories quickly became very crowded and very foul, simply because they lacked a lot of the social safety nets that we have now that make our lives livable. I sometimes tell my students, to get a sense of what life was like in early industrial Liverpool or Manchester, you have to imagine living in a city of 1 million people today. But imagine that city having no sewer systems, no sanitation, so no, regular garbage pickup, no regulation of food or water. There's no like EPA, regulating what goes into your food. There's no building codes making sure that houses are safe. There's no homeless shelters. There's no foster care or like child services to take care of children. But there's also no help for the disabled, no help for the injured. There's no workers' rights laws at this period of time. And there's no public medical care and there's no public schooling available, right? And to top all that off, there's no suffrage. So you couldn't vote to change any of these things if you were just kind of a regular guy and not a member of the aristocracy. So the 1840s, when Britain was exporting more goods than ever before, and it was importing just tons and tons of money and resources from its colonies, ironically, they were known as the Hungry 40s in the UK. And that's because a general recession and a couple of years of poor harvests happened to coincide with the potato blight that I'm sure you guys are all familiar with in Ireland. And it forced millions of people in the UK to starve to death in this place that was the world's economic powerhouse. So there's a kind of paradox that's happening when the missionaries are landing in Victorian England, right? You've got enormous wealth and enormous poverty living side by side at the same time. And this paradoxical embodiment of wealth and starvation is rendered really brilliantly, I think, in Charles Dickens's most famous book, A Christmas Carol. And it's especially captured by the ghost of Christmas present, which you can see in this illustration here. This is one of the original illustrations from Dickens's Christmas Carol. And if you remember this guy, he's the second ghost in the story. Well, if you count Jacob Marley as the first ghost, I guess he's the third ghost. But remember, there's the ghost of Christmas past, and then this is present, and then it gets to the ghost of Christmas yet to come. But if you remember this guy, and you may not, in the book, Dickens describes him as sitting on a throne that's made of cooked meat. And he's got food piled all around him when Scrooge first comes into the room and sees him. And you can't see this too well in the illustration, but you kind of get the hint of the food that's creating this kind of setting for him, right? Also cut off in this illustration here, if you could see up at the top of that, the Ghost of Christmas Present carries a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, as they call it. That's kind of his symbol. And he can light it up, but he can also sprinkle like magic sprinkle dust from his cornucopia on people that they pass. And that kind of imbues them with the spirit of Christmas, right? So Christmas Present himself is a kind of symbolic representation of England in all of her 1840s bounty, wealthier than any other nation on earth at the time. But you will remember that underneath his robes hide the two miserable little figures of ignorance and want. And in the book, Dickens writes that ignorance and want, these two children are the children of the Industrial Revolution. And if you look in this picture, this is also one of the original illustrations, you can see in the background way up at the top, um, the industrial factories that are chugging out smoke, right? The picture becomes this perfect kind of encapsulation of England in the 1840s, a land of simultaneous plenty, you know, so much that the ghost is like sitting on excess food. And at the same time, a land of hideous and as Scrooge writes, or as Dickens writes, wretched, abject, and frightful poverty. This, I think, is one of the reasons why Charles Dickens called A Christmas Carol his sledgehammer book. Isn't that a fun phrase, his sledgehammer? And the reason he did this is because of what inspired Dickens to write A Christmas Carol. Now, if you guys have seen the movie that came out a few years ago called The Man Who Invented Christmas, it's about Charles Dickens and it's about the writing of the Christmas Carol, but it takes a lot of Hollywood liberties. Um, Actually, the thing that inspired Charles Dickens to write A Christmas Carol was the publication of this book that I've got here on your slide. It came out in the spring of 1843, and it was a government report. Parliament had gotten together and put together a special commission because it wanted to investigate the condition of child laborers in Britain's mining industry. So this parliamentary commission sent out a bunch of kind of like on the spot investigators who went to a bunch of mines up in the Midlands, up in the north of England there. And they started interviewing a bunch of the workers, adults and children, to try to get a sense of what it's like to be a child worker in, as you can see, the mines and the collieries in the United Kingdom. And then when they published their report in this book form in 1843, the facts that came to light were just horrifying. Most people, especially if they were living down in London, like Charles Dickens was, they didn't know a lot of what was going on up north, unless you had family members that were involved in the industry, right? But when this report was released, all of these statistics and facts came forward. Things like, children as young as like 5 or 6 who were working 12-hour shifts down in the pits in pitch blackness, working for very, very little money. And these children sometimes never saw sunlight because their shifts at the mines started before the sun came up in the morning. So they were down before the sun was up, and their shifts ended after the sun had set. So by the time they got to, walk home at the end of the day, it was dark again. So you had children going, weeks at a time without ever seeing the sun. One of the little reports in this book was the interview with Joseph Richards, a little boy who was 7 years old and had been down in the mine working for 3 years and a half. Like, imagine that. That means he's been working in a mine since he was 3 or 4 years old, right? This was incredibly devastating to Charles Dickens and to a lot of other Victorians. And when Dickens read this parliamentary report, he was determined to write a political pamphlet in response. He wanted to highlight the very worst facts in the report, and he wanted to force British readers to see them. He figured that not many people would get around to reading this big, long, kind of dry, dusty report. But if he condensed some of the facts in the form of a pamphlet, that maybe that would circulate and force people to recognize what was going on, especially with these children up north, right? So he started work on this pamphlet and he wrote about it for a little bit. But after a couple of weeks, he changed his mind. He told a friend of his that he came up with a better idea. And he wrote a letter to this friend saying, the quote that I've got here on your slide, he wrote, "You will certainly feel that a sledgehammer has come down with 20 times the force, nay, 20,000 times the force, that I could exert by following out my first idea." Dickens was right. You know, we hear awful statistics about stuff all the time on the news and in the media. And if you're like me, like I hear them and then I feel really bad about them and I pretty instantly forget them. But when we hear a story, a fiction, if it's done right, it can move us more than any number of facts can. A Christmas Carol has never been out of print since it was published. You know, no one would have remembered a pamphlet among millions of pamphlets that were published in the 1840s, right? If Dickens had stuck with his first idea and just printed kind of this list of facts. But even today, 250 years after A Christmas Carol was first published, I would venture to guess that every single person in the English-speaking world knows who Ebenezer Scrooge and Tiny Tim are. Even if they haven't read the story itself, they've seen an adaptation, they've seen a movie, or they just know it's entered our culture. It's become what one scholar calls a culture text. Everybody knows this tale. And that, I think, is one of the marvels of literature, and it's why I love it. Fiction isn't true, right? It's all lies. It's just made up stories. But sometimes it manages to convey truth better than nonfiction can. If it's good, if it's done right, it can make us see in new ways. And it can, I think, inspire us to change. A Christmas Carol does that. I think A Christmas Carol is one of those texts that really does touch people's hearts and make them rethink the kinds of things that they're doing for their neighbors in their communities, right? Another really excellent, if a little bit more subtle, example of this kind of thing occurs in my favorite Dickens novel. It came out a few years after A Christmas Carol, and it's called Bleak House. In Bleak House, Dickens describes a little orphan boy named Joe. He is a homeless street kid who survives on like the pittance that people throw to him when he sweeps like the feces and the other garbage out of the street so that they can cross the street without getting their shoes dirty. That's how Joe survives. He lives in a slum and he only eats when he's made enough sort of sweet street sweeping that he can get, you know, a few pieces of bread to eat. He is utterly alone in the world. In fact, the slum that he lives in is called Tom's All Alone. He is illiterate and he is friendless, this little tiny kid. But here's the thing. Dickens knows that we would rather not look too closely at Joe. Just like we'd rather not make eye contact with the homeless people that we see on our street corners, it hurts a little bit. It makes me anyway uncomfortable to see unhoused people, you know, living. I live here in Provo, out on the streets, and if I'm not careful with myself, I look away because I don't want to look too hard. I don't want to look too long. I know it's there. I feel badly about it, but it makes me uncomfortable. And Dickens knows that the same thing is true when we encounter these characters in fiction, right? It's hard to look at characters who are painful. But Dickens, and here's kind of the brilliance of it, he doesn't give us the option of looking away in his novel. In fact, he does something incredibly powerful that I want to show you guys. Take a look at this clip. If you've got the handout in front of you, I've marked it as C, a letter C on the handout, but I'll read it here just quickly. This is Dickens writing in Bleak House, and he says, "It must be a strange state to be like Joe. It must be very puzzling to see the good company going to the churches on Sundays with their books in their hands, and to think, for perhaps Joe does think at odd times, what does it all mean? And if it means anything to anybody, how comes it that it means nothing to me? To be hustled and jostled and moved on, and really to feel that it would appear to be perfectly true that I have no business here or there or anywhere, and yet to be perplexed by the consideration that I am here somehow too, and everybody overlooked me until I became the creature that I am. It must be a strange state, not merely to be told that I am scarcely human, but to feel it of my own knowledge all my life, to see the horses, dogs, and cattle go by me, and to know that in ignorance I belong to them, and not to the superior beings in my shape, whose delicacy I offend." It always like chokes me up a little bit when I read this, because we begin reading this passage, this description of Joe, as ourselves, in the present moment, 2025, staring out at Joe. But then as we read, we're told to try a thought experiment. Imagine what it's like to be Joe, Dickens tells us. Imagine for a second what it's like to be confused and to be illiterate and to be overlooked and to be dehumanized. And then while we're trying to imagine that, Dickens slides us one step further. He turns us into Joe. This is a literary trick called free indirect discourse. And it happens when we're slipped from the position of an outsider looking at Joe to the position of being Joe himself, thinking Joe's thoughts. And that's what happens here, right? We begin the passage thinking, oh, it must be strange to be like that poor homeless kid over there. But we end the passage thinking, I have no business here. I am scarcely human, right? Those are not my thoughts, those are Joe's thoughts. In Dickens's literature, he creates fake people like Joe and fictional situations in order to bring home to his Victorian readers and to us the experience of being somebody else. And he does it, I think, because he believes that empathy changes people. It makes those who are able to help want to help. I've seen a lot of unhoused people in my life, but I've not had the opportunity, I've not been asked to think their thoughts very often outside of literature. And that's a profoundly moving experience to me, to try to put myself in the mind of someone who is so different from what I am, right? Charles Dickens wasn't the only Victorian writer to do this. This is Dickens's friend, Elizabeth Gaskell. And she also understood the potential of fiction to change people. Gaskell's novels and her short stories, she wrote lots and lots of really great short stories too. They all feature characters up in the northern industrial cities of England where poverty and hardship were often the greatest. And like Dickens, Gaskell uses stories of working class people to put a human face on the statistics and the facts that filled newspapers and government reports. Listen, for example, to what Gaskell says to readers in the preface of one of my favorite Gaskell novels, Mary Barton. Mary Barton is about a family of cotton mill workers in Manchester in 1839. So right about the same time that the missionaries landed up in Liverpool. Here's what she says. And this, by the way, it's a preface that she wrote after she had completed the novel, as she wanted to explain to her readers a little bit about what motivated her to write it. So this is what she says. This is what she writes in her preface. And this, by the way, this is on your handout and it's marked letter D. She says, 3 years ago, I became anxious from circumstances that need not be more fully alluded to employ myself in writing a work of fiction. Okay, That's an interesting sentence, I think, because the circumstance that she's like referring to, but not wanting to talk about, is actually the death of her 9-month-old baby son, which just gutted her. Like a lot of children in the 19th century, he died of the childhood diseases that we vaccinate for today. And he died at home in her arms, which must have been just an incredibly painful experience. So, as she says, she desperately needed something to distract her from her own grief. And so she decided to write a story. And at the time, Gaskell was living in the noisy, dirty, crowded Manchester. So she wanted to write a story that took place out in the beautiful countryside, where it was quiet and peaceful and full of flowers. And she started working on that story out in the countryside. But after a while, she couldn't do it. And she couldn't do it because even in her own grief, the pain of the poverty stricken factory workers that Gaskell says elbowed her daily, she can see here in her preface, these people who elbowed her daily in Manchester, it was too great to ignore. Gaskell writes that she had always felt a deep sympathy with the careworn men who looked as if doomed to struggle through their lives in strange alternations between work and want, tossed to and fro by circumstances. I like that Gaskell uses the word circumstances again here for the second time because it acknowledges that the grief of the poor, these factory workers who are rubbing elbows with her in Manchester, their circumstances are not too different from her own grief. Even though she is not poor and she is not hungry and she does not work in a mill, she understands pain. Gaskell goes on to say in this preface that the more she reflected on this unhappy state of things between those so bound to each other by common interests, the more anxious she became to give some utterance to the agony which, from time to time, convulses this dumb people. The agony of suffering without the sympathy of the happy. Like the word circumstances, Gaskell uses the word sympathy twice here in her preface. Sympathy becomes a driving force in all of Gaskell's novels. It's kind of like the glue that has the potential to bind the comfortable and the miserable together. Because as Gaskell says, we're already bound to each other by common interests. We live in the same cities, we experience the same environments. The good interests of our neighbors are good interests for us. And that's the reason I think that sympathy becomes, for Gaskell, a moral compulsion in the same kind of way that it was for Dickens. We must look even when we don't want to. We must learn to feel for other people, even and maybe especially at those times when our own grief or our own worry is threatening to overwhelm us. Another novel that Gaskell also set in the industrial North introduces readers to another kind of grief or worry that characterized the condition of England when the missionaries first disembarked. That novel is called North and South, and it's one of my favorites. And there's a fabulous BBC adaptation of North and South that you can find online if you want to spend a little bit of time getting to know Elizabeth Gaskell. But in North and South, the family of a character, a young woman named Margaret Hale, is forced to leave a very sunny, happy home down in the south of England and move to a fictional version of Manchester. That's the kind of south where they start off and north where they end up in the story. And the reason why they have to make this move is because Margaret's father, who's an Anglican vicar, he experiences a crisis of faith. Now, it's helpful, I think, to remember that it was in 1859 that Charles Darwin published his very famous On the Origin of Species. But long before that publication came out, many people in Victorian England had begun to doubt the faith that they had been raised in. In fact, in the 1820s, in Oxford, the university, a group of scholars began examining the founding documents of the Anglican Church, which, if you think back, to your school days, you probably remember that Henry VIII had started and had sort of made the state religion about 300 years, before that period of time. And the more that these scholars delved into those early church documents, the more they realized that the Anglican Church did not have the ecclesiastical authority that it claimed to have. And this had a really profoundly reverberating impact across England. Many Anglicans lost their faith because of this. It comes to be called the Oxford movement because it starts there among the Oxford scholars, right? But the scholars who were there doing this research, many of them are very high positioned within the Anglican Church. And when they lost their faith in Anglicanism, many of those people ended up converting to Catholicism. And this was a huge kind of cultural blow. I tell my students sometimes the only way you can really wrap your head around this is to imagine if maybe a member of the Quorum of the 12 in our church decided to convert to Catholicism. Because these people were so respected and they were so well known within the Anglican community, their deserting of Anglicanism for Catholicism, it racked the religious beliefs of a lot of people. And this is what happens in the novel North and South to the Hale family. And it's also, I think, the way that, or at least one of the ways that Victorian literature feels very modern to me. Because I'm a person of faith, like the characters in Gaskell's novel, like Mr. Hale, who experiences religious doubts, the pain of Gaskell's characters is very real to me. I understand people who have believed and who long to believe and yet struggle to believe, just like the characters in Gaskell's novel do. This same pain is also evident in the work of another Victorian writer, a poet this time instead of a novelist, named Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is a picture of Hopkins. Hopkins was raised Anglican, and he was always deeply religious from the time he was a little kid. But he ended up going to Oxford when he was university aged, and he was there during the time of the Oxford movement. And because of the research and publication that was going on there, he was one of the people who lost his faith in Anglicanism, and he converted to Catholicism. Now, his conversion to the Catholic Church devastated his family members, some of whom never spoke to him again because of it. And to make matters worse, Hopkins decided to devote his life to God, becoming a Catholic priest and a Jesuit to boot, right? So not even, leaving the Anglican Church and joining another church, but becoming a priest and becoming a Jesuit priest, some of the, one of the most committed sections of the Catholic faith. Now, Hopkins loved writing poetry, but he always felt guilty about doing so because he felt like every minute he dedicated to his writing was a minute that he could have been doing ministering work, right? A minute where he was distracting himself doing something fun instead of doing something godly. So a lot of his poetry did not get published until after his death. He was too embarrassed, and he didn't want to make people think that he was not serious in his devotion to God, which is remarkable because when you read his poems are magnificent in their praise of God and the world that God created. He's got this one sonnet that I really like. It's called Pied Beauty. And in it, Hopkins praises God for creating imperfect stuff. He says, things that are dappled or patchwork or freckled instead of stuff that is unblemished, which I really love. In another sonnet, Hopkins compares Christ to a bird, to a wind hover, which is kind of like a falcon. And he talks about how beautiful this bird is as it hovers kind of effortlessly up in the air. But then, how, as Hopkins writes, it becomes a billion times told lovelier when it swoops down to earth from heaven, like Christ did to save us. It's a kind of lovely comparison of Christ to this bird, who's at first up in the heavens and then comes down to the earth. But Hopkins, who literally gave everything that he had to the service of God, even he felt doubt from time to time. He wrote and he hid what have come to be called his terrible sonnets. And these sonnets are terrible, not because they're bad, they're terrible because in them, Hopkins admits that sometimes he struggled to believe, he struggled to keep the faith. He struggled with depression and anxiety, and sometimes he felt totally alone and abandoned by God. And for anyone who has struggled with their faith, or for anyone who loves someone who is struggling with their faith, these terrible sonnets are particularly powerful because they show us a person who is two things at once. He's both deeply committed to God and also deeply troubled by doubt and by fear. They kind of show us how to doubt and believe at the same time. Let me show you an example. In my favorite terrible sonnet, it's a sonnet called Carrion Comfort, which is clip E on your handout. Hopkins tells readers, he starts off by telling readers that he can't find comfort in taking the sacrament because he feels that God has abandoned him. He is a good Christian, so he knows that good Christians are not supposed to ask the question, why me? When they experience trials, right? This is the same thing we know all the time, right? When you experience trials and tribulations, you're supposed to ask, what am I supposed to learn from this? Not why me? But Hopkins asks it anyway, right? He pleads to God in this poem, who he pictures sitting on his throne in the heavens, resting his right foot on the world. And he says, why, God, why wouldst thou rude on me, thy ring-whirled right foot rock? Lay a lion limb against me, or scan with darksome, devouring eyes my bruised bones. In the Bible, God is sometimes compared to a lion, and he's sometimes compared to a lamb. But Hopkins imagines God here as a lion, and not in the good way, right? In Hopkins' imagination, God doesn't have a lamb limb, which I guess would be like a weird but kind of gentle little hoof. Instead, God wields a lion limb against him, a shredding, tearing, disabling claw that leaves Hopkins bleeding and bruised. In the second half of the sonnet, Hopkins writes that he knows the answer to his own question, just like we know it, right? If you do ask the question, why me? Why me, Lord? Why am I experiencing this hardship? We know the answer, right? The answer is, well, because it's supposed to test us and try us, right? And look what Hopkins writes in this part that I've kind of underlined in orange here. If we are sinful enough to ask God why he is allowing us to experience hardship, the correct answer is so that we can learn stuff. And that's what Hopkins says right here in this orange. He says, why? That my chaff might fly, my grain lie sheer and clear. But he's not buying this answer. He says, nay, even though he has often experienced joy in his faith. Hopkins now feels, as he says, foot trod by God. He feels like God's thrown him to the ground and stomped all over him. Have you guys ever felt that way? That despite doing everything you're doing everything you can to believe, you're just left on the ground crying and alone? I felt that way before. And that's probably why these final couple of lines of the sonnet are the most moving for me. Hopkins ends his poem with these words. He says, that night, that year of now done darkness, I, wretch, lay wrestling with, my God, my God. I've had nights that feel like entire years of darkness. Nights when I have been so sad or so hurt that they seem to last forever, no matter how hard I prayed. And Hopkins has been there too, right? He looks at himself in that moment of what he calls now done darkness, and he's shocked at what he sees. He sees himself a wretch in the sense of being like utterly despicable, the lowest of the low, just a miserable worm compared with God, and also a wretch in the sense of retching, right? Being violently ill, just totally overcome. And that wretch, that worthless nobody, has the gall to wrestle with God as if he were Jacob and the angel demanding a blessing. Like, who is he to demand anything from God? Who am I ever to demand anything of God, right? That Hopkins has the impudence to doubt shocks him, whose parenthetical, my God, with its exclamation point there, it conveys his disbelief at where his own doubts have taken him. He's a priest. He's a man who has devoted his entire life to the church, but a man with so much faith who nevertheless feels so forgotten. Hopkins, he can't even bring himself to write his final question. The final question that he wants to ask feels too blasphemous. So it's a question he puts on the page without actually putting it on the page, kind of like writing it in invisible ink. But every Christian who knows their Bible can see it as plain as day. You guys can see it. I know you can. Because when a Christian hears the last words of Hopkins's poem, my God, they also hear the next line that he hasn't written. Why hast thou forsaken me? We're not supposed to ask why we're being tried or why we have to face hardships. But Hopkins reminds us that even Jesus asked why. Even he felt abandoned and alone at one point in his life. You know, Hopkins' struggles with his faith, like the struggles of the characters in Gaskell's novel, remind us that during the Victorian era, British society was religiously fractured. You know, there had been Anglicans and Catholics in England for a long time, for centuries, right? But by the 19th century, there was a growing number of what came to be called dissenters. Dissenters were those who dissented from the articles of the Anglican faith, and so they had to find other faith communities. They were, as I've put here, Methodists and Baptists and Quakers and Lutherans and Presbyterians. And after the missionaries came in 1840, they were also the Mormons. And I call them Mormons and not Latter-day Saints because that's what the Victorians called them, and that's what they called themselves. Most of the people who joined the church in Preston and Manchester and Liverpool and other Lancashire cities were dissenters. They had already left the Anglican faith and they were trying to find their way to God through other religious routes. In fact, my ancestors, the Horrockses who lived in Preston and just outside of Manchester, were Methodists by the time they met the Mormon missionaries. And if your family joined the church in Northern England in the 1830s and 40s, they were probably dissenters as well. But even within the Anglican Church itself, there were fractures. Anglicanism in the 1800s had split into three main factions, I guess. High Church Anglicans adopted many of the reforms advocated by the members of the Oxford movement, and so they were very Catholic in their worship. People said there were lots of smells and bells that were used in High Church Anglican services. Low Church Anglicans didn't like the elitism of that kind of service where a priest spoke in Latin and everything seemed really far removed from the real world. Low Church Anglicans, they were concerned as much with the body as with the soul. They were the ones responsible for like starting soup kitchens and relief societies and Sunday schools. And then at the end, you've got Broad Church Anglicans. Broad Church Anglicans were the most liberal in their interpretation of doctrine. They found ways of harmonizing the gospel and the Bible with new discoveries in science and medicine that were coming out during the 19th century. And the most famous Broad Church Victorian writer was probably this guy right here, Alfred Tennyson, another Victorian poet that I really like. Now, you might know Tennyson's Arthurian poems, like The Lady of Shalott, or you might know him from The Charge of the Light Brigade. But my favorite Tennyson poem is actually a really long one. It's book length, and it's a poem that took him 20 years to write. It's called In Memoriam AHH. And the AHH stands for the initials of Arthur Henry Hallam. Hallam was Tennyson's best friend, who died suddenly when the two guys were just college aged. And you know, when you're in college and you're 20 something, you think you live forever, right? And you think your friends are going to live forever. And that's kind of how Tennyson felt. And so when his best friend died really suddenly from a brain aneurysm, it took him by surprise and it shocked him and it rocked him. And he wrote as a way to process the grief from that death. So In Memoriam is Tennyson's elegy for his friend, but because it stretches for 20 years, it's also a poem about like everything. It's a poem about life and love and happiness and fear and family and friendship. And it's especially about learning how to believe again after everything that happens to you in your life. So I like to have my students read parts of Tennyson's In Memoriam after they read Hopkins's terrible sonnets, because Tennyson shows us how he walks his way back to faith and back to God after bad things or hard things happen to him in his life. In one of the most famous sections of In Memoriam, Tennyson's thinking about the natural world, which he believes God has created, and why then God and nature seem to be, as he says, at strife. Tennyson says that nature is red in tooth and claw, and most of what is created dies, and dies quickly. What does this mean for human beings, he wonders? Do human beings matter any more than all of the seeds that never grow to maturity? Or do human beings matter more than like the dinosaurs who roamed the earth for a while, but now are just bones encased in rocks? Tennyson writes, "Shall he, man, nature's last work, who seemed so fair, be blown about the desert dust or sealed within the iron hills no more?" He's asking, like, will humans just go extinct too? Nature doesn't seem to care about life. So does God? Because isn't God in charge of nature? So what happens to faith then when we look at the natural world and all we see is death? Where are we supposed to find God if we can't find his hand in nature? Tennyson writes In Memoriam that he gets to a point where he can't find God anymore in nature's most wonderful creations. He says creations like eagle's wings and insect's eyes. Because when he sees these things, he sees the work of evolution, not God. But all of the evidence of science and evolution does not mean that Tennyson can't believe in God. Here's what he says, and this is clip F on your handout if you're following along. He says, "I found God not in world or sun or eagle's wings or insect's eye, nor through the questions men may try, the petty cobwebs we have spun. If ere when faith had fallen asleep, I heard a voice, believe no more, and heard an ever-breaking shore that tumbled in the godless deep, a warmth within the breast would melt, the freezing reason's colder part, and like a man in wrath, the heart stood up and answered, I have felt. No, like a child in doubt and fear, but that blind clamor made me wise. Then was I as a child that cries, but crying knows his father near. And what I am, beheld again what is, and no man understands. And out of darkness came the hands that reached through nature, molding man." What Tennyson says here is that when everything around him says, believe no more, he can still rely on the fact that somewhere at some time he felt something that testified to him of the existence of God. He couldn't see it, couldn't put it under a microscope, but he says, I have felt. And having felt, he can cry at times in doubt and fear, but he cries like a child who knows his father is nearby. I love the final stanza in this section when Tennyson admits that we know so little about everything. But what I am, beheld again what is. That's a lovely line. What am I? I am a being of infinite worth to God, if not to anybody else, right? I am the offspring of God. And what I am can turn and look at what is. My life, my loved ones, the world around me. And it's when we stop and turn and behold again what is, that we will see the hands that mold us. In other words, it's when we look at others that we see God. Now, I think I've got just a couple of minutes left to introduce you to one more Victorian writer, probably maybe my favorite of all the Victorian writers. Her name is George Eliot. Her actual name was Marianne Evans, but she went by the pen name George Eliot. And while Eliot was an atheist, she didn't believe in God, there's perhaps no other Victorian author more committed to the idea that what Eliot would call morality, but that I would call godliness, lies in turning to see others around us. Eliot fervently believed that the first responsibility of a writer is to teach readers how to care about other people. In her masterpiece, a novel that's called Middlemarch, which also takes place in 1830s England, by the way, Eliot writes, there is no general doctrine that is not capable of eating out our morality if unchecked by the deep-seated habit of direct fellow feeling with individual fellow men. Sympathy, feeling for others, Eliot says, is a habit, or it could be. And we can learn it by reading. And not just reading about perfect people who are easy to love because they're beautiful and they're good. Eliot believes that literature's real value is that it can teach us to care about imperfect, flawed people. Fellow mortals, every one, must be accepted as they are, she writes. It is these people amongst whom your life is passed that it is needful that you should tolerate, pity, and love. These more or less ugly, stupid, inconsistent people for whom you should cherish all possible hopes, all possible patience. All of us at times are ugly and stupid and inconsistent. And what Eliot is telling us here is that it's easy to feel for kind, beautiful, noble people. But what we need to be taught through literature is how to feel for real human beings, actual human beings. Eliot's goal, she says, is to turn a harder, colder eye on the real, breathing men and women who can be chilled by your indifference or injured by your prejudice, who can be cheered and helped onward by your fellow feeling, your forbearance, your outspoken, brave justice. Do you notice Eliot's use of the second person pronoun here, the you? It's quite uncommon in novels, but she's broken the wall of narratorial invisibility to talk to you, real breathing men and women who can be cheered or chilled by your actions, your choices. This is, in a way, it's the same thing Carlyle was saying when he urged his readers to awake and arise, right? It's the same thing Dickens was doing when he moves readers from looking at poor Joe to being poor, homeless Joe. Victorian writers believed that they had an obligation to remind us of the responsibilities we have to one another, for no other reason than we are fellow humans occupying the same planet. So when those Mormon missionaries landed in Britain in 1837, this was the kind of secular gospel that many Victorian writers were trying to preach. In a time of poverty and disenfranchisement and doubt, and a time of incredible wealth and growth, writers like Carlyle and Dickens and Gaskell and Hopkins and Tennyson and Eliot and many, many others were trying to teach people through their writing how sympathy can instigate change, how it can help us to see the godly in the human. And I can't help but think that the astonishing success that Heber C. Kimball and John Taylor experienced in England might have had something to do with authors who had prepared Victorian readers to develop that habit of fellow feeling that Eliot describes in order to make their communities just a little bit better for everyone. Thank you. And I will stop sharing now so that you guys can ask your questions.
I would like to jump in and just say one thing. I want to thank Jamie. I thought that was absolutely exquisite, because I had never really thought about the connection between the missionaries landing in England to share the gospel of Jesus Christ amidst all of these authors that are encouraging us to be sympathetic to our fellow human beings. It was just such a beautiful way to understand. You know, we sometimes wonder how different seekers are made. And, you know, I kind of sometimes think they come as seekers, it's sort of embedded in their soul. But this also makes me perhaps think that they're made by, as you mentioned here, Jamie, great authors that touch on the need for, you know, that common humanity in each of our souls. So I thought it was so beautiful. Thank you.
I had a quick question, and I think you addressed it to some degree. But it seems to me that the majority of the people that we find converting to the gospel are the poor and the probably not very well schooled. How do you feel that this kind of background percolated down to the mass?
Really great question. So one of the favorite activities of middle-class Victorian people in the 19th century was to pass out free pieces of literature in the poor areas of town. And it comes to be called slumming or sometimes missionary literature. And there's something very elitist about it. Like, it makes me uncomfortable to think of a person, walking to a poor person and saying, here's a little like pamphlet with a chapter by Dickens, or here's a little short story by Elizabeth Gaskell. If you read this, it will make you a better person, right? There's something kind of classist about that type of attitude. But it was actually a way that literature got into a lot of the areas of communities where people weren't going to school. They didn't have a lot of time to read. And remember too that during the 1830s, people didn't have gas lighting. So if you wanted to read, especially if you want to read after you do a shift of work, you have a candle or a fire. And if you've ever tried to read by a candle or by a fire when it's dark outside, it's just really hard to read. So getting literature to people in small, kind of manageable packages was really important. And that's one of the ways they did it, was taking these kind of like missionary type pamphlets and dispersing them by the hundreds of thousands in slum areas. I think too, also there's a big culture of lecturing in the Victorian era. And you get a sense of this when you hear about like early church meetings where somebody like Sidney Rigdon would just lecture for like 3 hours straight, right? People were used to going and standing and listening to people talk for a really long time. I can't do that today. But that was also a way that people in the poorest communities were exposed to ideas that they couldn't get because they couldn't afford to buy a newspaper, they couldn't afford to go to school.
Actually, I have one question for you, Dr. Horrocks. Have you ever read Orson Scott Card's historical novel Saints?
I have, in fact, yes.
Because he starts with a very Dickens-like
Yep.
introduction with these characters in 19th century England and some of the wretched circumstances there. Uh,
Yeah, I think the family that he starts with is actually a family of mill workers up in the industrial
yeah,
north
yeah.
that convert and then move.
He's basically doing a it's thinly disguised analogs for the snows. Uh, but first time I read it, I mean, it's one of my favorite novels of his. But first time I read it, I thought I feel like I'm reading something out of 19th century literature because it's the same very harsh, very brutal lifestyle, the impoverished, and then they join the church and go off to America.
There must have been a time in early Utah settlement, in the early or in the 40s when they first got there, where you would walk down the streets of Salt Lake City and just hear British accents. Like, there were so many members of the church that came out of the UK that it must have been funny. You must have thought you were in a different place.
That's it. That I literally, I mean, I know all the stats about, having more members in England than in the US, the Great Migration, but I never quite put that together. And you're right. I'm sure that British accents were prevalent all over the Intermountain West.
Well, thank you guys for listening. Please
Oh,
feel free
it was
to
outstanding.
email.
I appreciate it tremendously.
Yeah, feel free to email if you've got any questions, but I will talk to you guys later if that's okay.
Great.
All
Thank you
right.
so
Thank you.